Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, testing, testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to PI. For those of you who have never been here, welcome. My name is Dr. Bamei Ting, and I'm the program coordinator of the History and Regional Studies department here. And of course, I'm super happy to be moderating this panel, this session, because Creighton is an old friend of mine. We met back in NUS in Singapore about like 7 years ago, I think, when he was a postdoctoral fellow there, and I was his mentee when I was doing a fellowship there. So it's great to have Creighton here. So I guess in a way, thank you, Asia Research Institute, for introducing us. And you know, long story short, and then like here we are at Penang Institute today. So before we have Dr. Creighton Connolly speaking, I will let me introduce him properly first. Yeah. So Dr. Creighton Connolly is Assistant Professor in Hong Kong University's Department of Urban Planning and Design. And prior to joining in January 2023, Creighton held faculty positions in the School of Graduate Studies at Lingnan University in Hong Kong from 2021 to 2022, and the University of Lincoln in UK from 2018 to 2021. He also worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore from 2016 to 2018. That's when we met. He obtained his PhD in Human Geography from the University of Manchester and MA in Geography from the Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada, and a BA in Geography from the University of British Columbia. Trained as an urban political ecologist, his work examines processes of urban and environmental governance, planning, and development, focusing on the Southeast Asian region. His current research spans a range of topics, including political ecologies of land reclamation, large-scale infrastructure projects, participatory governance and planning, heritage management, and the relationships between urbanization and infectious disease. Creighton has teaching experience in many of these areas at the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. His teaching crosscuts local, national, and international scales and emphasizes real-world case studies. So something non-academic, and a non-academic fact about Creighton is that he is an avid marathon runner and walker. So like if you just Google his name, you'll see his name popping up for running events. And you actually find his profile on the official Olympic team website for Team Canada. Can you believe it? We have an Olympian sitting right here. So, Creighton, have you? Not quite. Have you tried the Penang Bridge run, the Penang Bridge Marathon? You should. You totally should. I mean, like, it's always hats off to all those who actually run marathons, especially the full marathons, because every time I run a marathon, by the second minute, I'm already questioning my life decisions. Yeah, so anyway, you should. But anyway, over to you, Creighton. And of course, thanks for being here today.
Okay, so thank you, Mei Ting, for the very kind introduction and invitation to come here and helping to facilitate the talk. Yes, I'm not quite Olympic runner, but I used to do race walking competitively, representing Canada. So that's where I think what you're referring to. But been running kind of more at a more what do you say, amateur level since 2016, 17. Haven't done the Penang Bridge Marathon yet, but I have done the Hong Kong, Zhuhai, Macau Bridge Marathon. They have to get some use for that bridge. Anyways, yes, we met at the Asia Research Institute in Singapore in 2017 or so. And that's also when my research for this book started. So yeah, I made a couple of trips here to during that time for a couple weeks at a time, and really got to know Penang, and kind of came back over the next 2018, 2019. And that followed my PhD research, which was on the swiftlet farming issue in Georgetown. So I'd lived here during that time in Georgetown in a former swiftlet house. And when I completed my PhD in 2016, that swiftlet issue was kind of starting to die down a bit. But then these broader urban redevelopment issues in Penang were starting to become, more, what do you say, bubbling to the surface, and becoming more of an issue of concern. So I started doing some research on that. Then I got the contract for this book in the fall of 2019, I guess September, October, and then COVID happened, and so I wasn't able to actually visit at all during the writing of this book, which was then published in 2022, about 2 years ago now. So this is my first time back since 2019. It's very nice to be back in Penang and see some familiar faces, and also to share this book and the research that I did for it. And also at the Penang Institute, which held a lot of public forums on various issues that were that are included in this book, including Pulau Jerajak and other redevelopment issues. All right, so the format today, I'll give an overview of the book, and then leave lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards, and then also have some limited numbers of physical copies of the book to purchase. And then I have a discount code also. There's a e-version that you could order online, and additional physical copies should we run out. Okay. So, right. So political ecology, I will introduce that in more detail later on. But I think the landscape theme is quite central throughout the book, as is political ecology. Given the broad nature of the urban redevelopment projects that have been going on in Penang and that I've been studying, and the particular nature of the landscape here and how it's understood and represented by people, and how it's really shaped Penang's development over the years. Okay. So the main question that's asked in this book is how are large-scale urban development and redevelopment processes transforming the urban environment at the landscape scale. So that kind of cuts across the urban areas, but also what you might call natural or rural, peri-urban landscapes. So including places like Penang Hill and the kind of marine environment as well. And it's also looking at the types of innovative urban governance approaches that have been developed here to try and achieve more sustainable forms of urbanization. So participatory planning. Penang has, a very unique and active civil society sector in Penang, or in Malaysia and Southeast Asia more broadly. Hong Kong used to have a very similar kind of civil society sector, but sadly has since died down in the last few years. Okay, so I think that's something that a lot of places outside of Penang can learn from, and particularly in rapidly urbanizing contexts in Southeast Asia and East Asia more broadly. So that's one of the main purposes of writing this book. So to kind of convey Penang's experience to a wider international audience. And I'm a geographer, as Mei-Ting said, but yeah, most of my research has been related to urban planning and governance development issues. And so now I find myself in a urban planning and design department, even though I don't really have that formal background. Yeah. Right, so the central focus of the book is the Penang Transport Master Plan and the related projects that have been going on for the last 12 years or so in Penang, including the Southern Reclamation Scheme. So of course, this is an old map of the projected or the planned PTMP with the various transport lines that were associated with it, and then the three islands which have now been scaled down to one. Okay, so it also situates the PTMP within Penang's 2030 vision for a green and smart state, and that builds on the previous campaign of the government on clean and green Penang. When I was doing the research for this book, Chow Kon Yao had mentioned that, oh yes, in the future, I think maybe we'll move towards a smart state vision, which was becoming more popular at the time. But now you could argue that even the kind of smart city discourse is moving on now to kind of AI driven cities. Okay, so it ties into these broader kind of planning and development discourses. Hong Kong also has a very similar green, smart, green, resilient 2030 plus strategy, trying to achieve climate, resilience and zero carbon development. Also packaged into like a 2030 vision based on infrastructure development and land reclamation and so on. So these kinds of plans are not unique to Penang, and actually they are very common in other parts of the urbanizing Asia. So I think this, the PTMP in particular, and this case is interesting for the various competing visions that have emerged for Penang's future. So the PTMP was, as many of you might know, initially an idea proposed by civil society, and that was kind of co-opted by the government. And so then there were kind of competing ideologies or discourses about what the PTMP should entail and how it should be carried out. Right. So a little bit more of a theoretical discussion about the underpinning of the book. I'm an academic, so apologies for that. So the urban political ecology is this type of strand of research that developed in, I'd say, the late 1990s, early 2000s to really highlight this idea that cities are not just, built environments, and actually they do encompass a lot of natural spaces that are encompassed within the city, and they're based on this idea of urban metabolism. So that's taken from this kind of biological metaphor that your body will take in various material inputs, natural inputs, and then it'll be processed, used for energy, and then you have the outputs and waste that are somehow put somewhere and somehow further processed. So it looks at that process of the urbanization of nature, so how nature becomes bound up with the urban environment, and also the more than human relations that are involved in cities. So especially in Penang and in Hong Kong and other places where you have lots of different biodiversity ecosystems right within the urban context. Okay. And also questions of social and ecological justice. Are developments happening that are fair and equal to people and ecosystems, and then do people face unequal burdens from particular development? You could say, for example, pollution or other kinds of externalities of development. So then on the other hand, the landscape side, it looks at, comes more from a cultural geography perspective, and looks at this cultural, environmental, historical associations with the landscape, sense of place attachment, which has been really important, I think, to the types of discourses that are covered in this book, and that have really helped to shape narratives and ideologies about how Penang should develop in the future, based on the realities of its existing landscape, which is quite unique within the region. Okay? And it's also, I like it because it's holistic, it's non-binary, so we can move beyond these rural, urban, cultural, natural, debates and binaries. And at the same time is issues of politics and power relations, conflict, and so on, which are very central to a lot of the controversies and issues covered in the book. Okay, so yeah, as I said, the research was initially in person. The first few years, I did some semi-structured interviews and even walking interviews with people through Penang streets and hillsides. And that was followed up remotely through COVID. So I was well connected in social media in Penang on various Facebook groups. A lot of the Penang Forum talks, PhD talks were all done hybrid, so I could follow online, and that really helped me to stay in touch with issues that were going on. And as I was writing the book, and also looked at a lot of planning documents and reports and so on, using narrative and documentary analysis. So how are the decisions that are made portrayed by different actors, and so what is the broader kind of context and underpinning of the decisions that are made, rather than just looking at what is actually happening. Right? So this issue of how things are represented by people is quite important. So then we get into the more substantive chapters of the book from chapter 3 onwards. It's 6 chapters in total, okay, plus the conclusion. So this one, chapter 3, it looks at this issue of urban expansion in Penang. So how looking at the spatial strategy for the Georgetown conurbation, how it's connected to the northeastern economic or the northern economic corridor in Malaysia. So how Georgetown is connected to Butterworth and even further to Thailand and Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. Malaysia, the national physical plan kind of breaks down the urban development into 5 of these conurbations. So we have Kuantan, Kuala Lumpur, Georgetown, Johor Bahru, and then some regional cities as well beyond that. So you can see this hierarchy in the map there. And this highlights how cities are not discrete entities, but are actually really deeply connected to their surrounding hinterland and environment through infrastructure networks, and shows how Penang has really been expanding into its hinterlands. But also looks at plans to reconcentrate Penang's development within the mainland side of the state and Seberang Perai to take some pressure off of Georgetown. The Seberang Perai has a lot more developable land than Penang does, and it looks at some of the comparisons made between Hong Kong and Kowloon, for example. Penang is always aspiring towards Hong Kong and Singapore and other Kuala Lumpur and other regional cities, right? So how Butterworth has also been kind of modernized through transport infrastructure and redevelopment, and ideas about how Penang could develop that side of the state to really attract more investment and maybe turn Georgetown into more of an arts, heritage, cultural center and move the business activity to other parts of the state. So this theoretically, the book kind of ties into broader debates about this planetary urbanization, as it's been called, how cities are really looking at urbanization as a process, so how they're expanding across the entire fabric of the world. So actually how places are not merely just, cities are not just cities, but you could find even rural spaces that are deeply connected to urbanization. Right. So then chapter 4 gets into this PTMP and the competing visions for it. So how the PTMP has been promoted to try and achieve increase economic development in Penang, attract greater investment, Of course, transport infrastructure is one of the major challenges for urbanization in Penang because of the congestion. You could say lack of public transport infrastructure, with I think it's like 85% of the modal share is actually private cars. So different plans to increase Penang's connectivity, which will help attract investment and further development in the state, but also how civil society groups have proposed alternative ideas that are based on cheaper, faster to implement forms of public transit that would counter this this very infrastructure, like mega infrastructure heavy, costly infrastructure envisioned for the PTMP, and also how they've learned from experiences of other comparable cities around the region. You could say, you know, Suzhou, for example, in China, and other cities that are more mid-sized cities rather than, you know, Hong Kong, Singapore, which have very different, you know, population and financial contexts. Then chapter 5 moves on to the kind of environmental governance in Penang. So how this is where the political ecology aspect really becomes more foregrounded. So it asks, to what extent can the existing civic cultures in Penang help to move beyond mere resilience to environmental threats and to promote more genuinely sustainable forms of development. So as I was doing the research for this book in 2017, 18, 19, Penang had like increasingly severe and frequent flooding and landslide events that killed a number of people. And those were due largely to development, either illegal or illegal developments on the hillsides. So it looks at the Penang Hills Watch and other initiatives that were started by Penang Forum and other grassroots organizations to kind of assist the government with monitoring the hillside development, and also to give broader kind of understanding about and clarity to the public about what are the developments that are happening on the hillside. Of course, there was the Botak Hill incident where there was a big clearing on Penang Hill that was visible from the Penang Bridge. And that was, I think, allegedly illegal development. So just to try and prevent these things from happening and get people that were, you know, hiking on the hillsides, they could just take a photo and upload this photo to a database that anyone could then look up. And so I think these kind of initiatives are very useful for developing more sustainable forms of urban development. Also getting people, you know, everyday people involved in environmental governance. So I think one of the good things that the Penang Forum and other groups have done is to try and open up, you know, make these types of urban development and governance issues more of a public matter, get more people involved. So these types of different technologies of governance that have been developed here, and the types of civic cultures that have been nurtured through these kind of everyday and experiential encounters and experiences with the natural environment in Penang, that has fostered this you could say environmental imaginaries and place attachment and so on. So to try and mobilize people into protecting the environment. Okay, so I think resilience, this concept of resilience is a bit problematic because it very much draws in the idea that, okay, well, development is going to happen. We're going to have increasingly severe climate change. So we have to adapt, right? So it's about adaptation rather than prevention. And largely it is done through techno-managerial approaches, so increasing, you know, the size of the drainage canals to handle the floodwater and so on, but rather than addressing the fundamental issues that are causing the flooding or the landslides in the first place, or causing climate change in the first place. So it's more about these proactive things that can be done to reduce the vulnerabilities of people and the broader ecosystems to environmental threats or disasters. Okay. So it's trying to reframe resilience by considering the well-being of entire ecosystems. So this is called planetary health in some contexts. So looking at not only at human health, but also the health of the wider environment and ecosystems and biosphere. Okay. Some people would say that the COVID-19 crisis was a symptom of kind of this unhealthy planet, right, where we have expanding urbanization into the hinterlands, and that creates greater space for these pathogens to cross over the species boundaries into humans. Right? Coincidentally, just before COVID hit, I was helping a friend do research on bats, bat pollination of durian, and bats had been very much criticized for being, the source of COVID or SARS before that and other pathogens. So, yeah, just coincidental perhaps that then the next year there was this massive pandemic. So this chapter then looks at the types of new environmental affinities that can foster greater socio-ecological cohesion. So I have this photo from the Langer project, which had done some work to try and conserve the langurs and reduce incidence of roadkill in Penang. And this is obviously a very iconic species, but I think these types of movements are really useful, and they also did a lot of kind of mobilization to get people involved and aware of the threats of facing these that our non-human companions are facing. And I know Rebecca in the audience has done a lot of campaigning also for the Malayan tiger, which is also under threat. So yeah, trying to promote the well-being of broader ecosystems and flora and fauna. Right. Okay. So chapter 6 then talks about urban heritage conservation and the integration of cultural and natural, urban and rural heritage in Penang. So of course, Georgetown is known for the Cultural World Heritage Site in Georgetown. But a number of people have argued that Penang's heritage goes well beyond the World Heritage Site, and not only in terms of cultural and built heritage, but also the natural heritage, which has since been recognized through the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve on Penang Hill, which was launched just before this book was published. So I think that's a really exciting initiative, and it can again create greater awareness of the kind of connected nature of the cultural and natural heritage in Penang. And this is an area where there's a lot of, I guess you could say, disciplinary and professional divide in terms of we have cultural heritage conservation on one hand, and then biodiversity conservation on the other hand. And there's not a lot of interface between the two. UNESCO, of course, has mixed heritage sites and the biosphere sites, which is a newer kind of movement. So there's increasing recognition that the two are interlinked, but I think Penang is a really interesting case that highlights the interconnection between both types of heritage. And I would also argue that both types of heritage can be used to and integrated in sustainable urban development initiatives to try and develop more sustainable forms of urbanization. So a lot of people have argued, as I document in the book, that any kind of development that happens in Penang should take into account the existing landscape and the cultural and natural heritage, and really try and promote that in any development decisions that are made. So the Biosphere Reserve, I think, is quite good for developing forms of tourism that are not based on mass tourism, but actually promote and help to further conserve the natural heritage in the state. Okay. Right, so this chapter I think also talks about some of the history of conservation in Penang and the proposed developments on Penang Hill, and how those help to really develop and foster this the grassroots organizations in Penang and civil society movements, and of course the Penang Global City Center, I think it was, that was in the 1990s and helped formulate the PHT initially, and so kind of goes back to how these types of movements had been formed based on proposed development projects that in some cases thankfully didn't happen. Right, so then of course it talks about this biosphere reserve and how the different actors that were involved in making this happen, the Penang Hill Corporation and the habitat at Penang Hill, which I also talk about briefly in the book as this kind of important type of ecotourism destination that can also promote awareness of Penang's unique ecosystems and so on, and developing these more place-sensitive forms of tourism development and so on, and creating this public research station for urban ecologies, so you could have researchers and from around the world coming to Penang and to develop Penang as a hub beyond just merely a global city, which arguably it will never be because of the realities of the existing kind of landscape and population and business and so on. But we can make Penang known as more of a biodiversity or cultural or arts hub, so not just trying to replicate experience of other cities, but trying to develop Penang's own approach to urban development. Right, so there had been a lot of research on worlding cities by scholars that had studied cities in the global south, so like in India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and other places. So it's really problematizing this idea of a world city, right? So like a Hong Kong or London, New York, but actually arguing that a lot of cities around the world can be seen as worlding cities. So they have various processes that make them world cities. Penang's history, for example, it was one of the penultimate world cities, you could argue, back, and that is reflected in Penang's current social, cultural diversity. So really promoting these other ways of understanding Penang's kind of global uniqueness and worldness, you could say. Right, so then the last chapter in the book talks about the development of artificial islands and land reclamation. So of course we have the reclamation on Gurney, along Gurney Drive and Sri Tanjung Penang, so that we can see an older photo of this on the slide here. But of course the Southern Reclamation Scheme and a lot of these had emerged as means of financing the infrastructure associated with the PTMP, so the undersea tunnel, for example, to connect Penang with the mainland, and other highway infrastructure and the monorail and LRT infrastructure, because of course the state did not have the finances to develop this infrastructure, particularly before when there was an opposition state. The idea was that Penang wasn't getting any money from the federal government, so we have to adopt more entrepreneurial forms of governance. So there's this kind of land swap arrangements where the state would sell land, didn't have much more existing land to sell, so then the option is to reclaim land to then sell to developers, and then they will help to develop the infrastructure projects. Right, but then this raised a lot of controversies about, do we need all this land reclamation? As one of the previous chapters pointed out, there's land that can be used in Seberang Perai and existing brownfield sites that can be redeveloped. And do we need also the transport infrastructure in the first place? So it also ties into some research that local researchers from USM had done on the biodiversity impacts. Of course, there had been environmental assessment, impact assessments done for these projects, but EIAs are always a bit controversial. I mean, they're done by developers, right? So then usually they will allow the project to go ahead. And so using Hong Kong as an example, there was a EIA done for a similar large-scale artificial island project, and it said that, oh, the waters are, in that area are not significant in terms of biodiversity, but then, we propose all these mitigation measures to avoid impacts on these various species during reclamation work. So it's like, oh, well, if it has all these impacts, then how is it not biologically sensitive? So anyways, there had been some research done on well, A, the biodiversity there, and then B, okay, if the projects are going to go ahead anyways, then how can we develop, say, artificial kinds of corals that can help to mitigate some of the impacts of the development. Conceptually, it also ties into this idea of planetary urbanization, where, yeah, cities are not only expanding into their hinterlands, but also into the marine environment, right? And so into formerly ocean spaces. You could say ocean sprawl as opposed to urban sprawl. But also this increasing role of artificial structures in marine and coastal ecosystems through these various mitigation measures that have been proposed. Right, so then the conclusion is actually done through a vignette about the controversies over development in Pulau Jerajak, which, as I mentioned, there was a Penang forum on Pulau Jerajak, and Mike Gibby had written a book about the island, and I took a number of trips with him there on the research he was doing. So it uses Jerajak as this kind of touchstone of future development in Penang. And so on one hand, okay, are we going to have the vision that leaves Jerajak undeveloped as this kind of maybe cultural, natural reserve, or is it going to have all the development that has been proposed there over time, with the bridge connecting it to the island, and redoing the resort and other things? So that's part of the conclusion. The other part kind of restates the main contributions and main themes of the book. So talking about the importance of urban, cultural, and natural heritage for socio-ecological well-being and sustainable development. So how the natural and cultural heritage and landscapes are very much intertwined, and how they really shape public imaginaries about how development should, the form that development should take, and the various relationships that people form with the natural environment, and also how these discursive constructions of place, so how place is represented, the types of place attachment that are very important to understanding the ways in which urban natures are given meaning by residents. And of course, there are competing discourses in Penang. So, I mean, you have the discourse that Penang is a developing state, Malaysia is a developing country, so we should have development, right? We shouldn't be against development. That's not what anyone's arguing here. Just that people are arguing that, well, Penang should have, a unique form of development that is more sensitive, place sensitive. So it goes into those different kind of competing ideologies as well. So how the development has been justified and so on. And so as an example, I remember in the conclusion chapter, I have this quote from Rexy Chaco, who is the Penang Forum member, and he has done a lot of like kind of grassroots work in Penang. He was part of the Penang Hills Watch, and he recounts growing up nearby Pulau Jerajak and just viewing out at the kind of green, verdant landscape, and how that really kind of shaped his current interests in biodiversity and hiking and so on, even though he works in IT or something, right? So certainly not a professional interest. So just as a final kind of acknowledgement and dedication, I really do hope that Penang can achieve a more socio-ecologically just and sustainable future. And also, a lot of the ideas in the book are not my own ideas, but they are kind of documenting ideas that have been proposed by other people, some of whom in the audience. So it's just kind of bringing those debates and discussions and proposals to a wider audience and kind of documenting all the development trajectory of Penang until the time of writing, which of course all these developments are still going on. Some of them have started, some of them haven't yet. Some of them have been shelved only to be, brought out later on, like the cable car. That was a very, on and off again thing. So yeah, thanks to everyone. And I can't, of course, list everyone who has helped with the book. And then finally, yes, I do have some copies of the book. They're selling at 200 ringgit, which is cheaper than I can buy it myself. And then also there's the discount code that you can use online from the publisher website. And there's an e-version as well, which is much more affordable. Unfortunately, there's no paperback yet, but hopefully sometime in the future. So thank you, and look forward to any discussion and questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Creighton. So whenever I start the Q&A session, I like to just draw back to the very beginning. Also because personally, as an urban anthropologist, this is how I wrap my head around things, right? I think the most obvious question to start this off is why Penang? I mean, your PhD was on swiftlet farming, right? So, but why Penang? Did you live in Penang before, or why the interest in Penang?
Okay, yeah, good question. So, it was because of my PhD research. I had visited Penang before that, but not much. I was interested again in the controversies over the swiftlet farming. And so I did some research in Malacca, Georgetown, and a little bit in Kota Kinabalu as well. But I found that Georgetown had the most, you could say, significant controversies over the swiftlet issue. Rebecca Wilkinson had done a lot of advocacy work here. And so I found that, Penang was just the most interesting place as to use as a case study. So I spent several months here at the time, just walking around the heritage site. And this was before drones were readily available. So I was manually trying to figure out, okay, which building is an active swiftlet farm? And they were, of course, illegal at the time, but still happened anyways. And so looking at the various potential health impacts, heritage impacts of the swiftlet farms. But then, so then I just, while I was here, as I said, got interested in these broader urban redevelopment issues that were going on at the time.
Okay, and I know you said that Hong Kong has a very different landscape from Penang in terms of population demographies and all that, but you're based in Hong Kong now, right? How would you compare Hong Kong's urban landscape to that of Penang's?
Yeah, actually, it's very similar in many ways, and that's part of the reason why I'm there now. Because as you mentioned, I was in the UK, worked there for a few years as a lecturer, and then COVID hit, and I needed somewhere. All my research was based in Asia, so I wanted to move somewhere where I could do research, without having to travel so far. And I found that, Hong Kong, it has similar kind of historical context of Penang, and then it has very similar geography. So it has this densely populated island with very little developable land and forested, hilly central part of the island, but then a kind of flatter peninsula, or not peninsula, but in Hong Kong it's peninsula, but hinterland, you could say, of the island. So they're very similar in that sense, but also the kinds of development projects that are now being proposed in Hong Kong are very similar. So I mentioned there's a 3-island artificial island reclamation project there called Kawi Chau Artificial Islands, which is being proposed, should start soon, but also very controversial for similar reasons as the one here. And then it also has, greater infrastructure development trying to connect Hong Kong with the Greater Bay Area. So in that sense, they're quite similar, and that's somewhat surprising to me. As Hong Kong's arguably more developed in terms of the infrastructure, but yet we still see many of the same plans for infrastructure development. So hoping to do some kind of comparative work on Hong Kong and Penang in the future in terms of the large scale infrastructure development and urban development.
Like what sort of like best practices do you think that Penang could learn from Hong Kong? Are there like none?
I think Hong Kong could actually learn from Penang as well.
Oh, okay.
So I gave a talk at the Penang Heritage Trust that a couple of you were at. Like talking about how Hong Kong has been referenced in Penang's development aspirations, but then Hong Kong is doing many of the same things that I would criticize about Penang. So actually, I think it could learn from Penang's experience in that sense. I mean, one thing that Penang could learn would maybe be about these nuts and bolts of having more public transit, buses and trams and things. So even though Hong Kong is very fast-paced city, people have no time for anything, and it's very efficient, but yet we have this very old tram network, which is always crowded, and people use it. It's very cheap. So why does that kind of thing still exist when we have ferries that connect Kowloon and Hong Kong, even though there are two or three MTR lines that connect both places. So I think in terms of the nuts and bolts of public transit infrastructure, I think Penang could improve. Having clearing the 5-foot ways and so that pedestrians can walk around, or having sidewalks and things like that, which are non-existent in some places. And I do still say that Hong Kong is very not pedestrian friendly because it has a lot of this raised pedestrian infrastructure, like overpasses, rather than just having level crossings. But it's still a bit better than Penang in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Hong Kong like 3 times in the last year, and my most recent trip was just in May, as I was telling you. And I mean, like the trams are great, but I don't think I could survive even as a tourist there without the trains, though. Like, I mean, like I think it would be a disaster without the trains, the MTRs.
Yeah.
But also, I think it's interesting, of course, that the trams are there. But I think one thing I must say is that Penang roads aren't as wide as Hong Kong's, even though they are very densely populated. But also, Penang simply doesn't have the same the fiscal level as Hong Kong. But like, which cities in the world would you find exemplary when it comes to this situation, like commuting issues in a fairly densely populated area?
Yeah.
Which cities would you think everyone could learn from?
Well, I mean, Singapore is one that's always used, referenced as being like kind of this ideal model of public transit, and they heavily tax car ownership. Hong Kong, not so much, although parking is prohibitively expensive. So they do it in that way. Vancouver also puts a tax on gasoline, so that tax is then invested into public transit infrastructure. But I mean, in terms of places that have a similar kind of context, Singapore is one that's very frequently referenced, and I think it's, having lived there, it's quite good in terms of the public transit and congestion issues. I would say that. But of course, both Penang and Hong Kong and Singapore have much larger populations and much larger revenues. Well, not really revenues, but fiscal reserves for doing that. But a lot of the infrastructure can be done quite cheaply as well.
Coming to using trains, I don't think because like I go to Singapore a lot as well. It's almost second home. But yeah, also similarly, in Singapore, I don't think I'd be able to commute anywhere without their trains. Really, yeah. Like I just want to like come back to the theoretical part of
Okay.
your book. Yeah.
Surprising.
No, yeah, because like that's what I'm interested in anyway. So like you were talking about landscape political ecology,
Yeah.
LPE, and
Mhm.
urban political ecology.
Yeah.
I know you briefly explained what it is,
Yeah.
but like the two terms are really very close, just
Yeah.
different
Mm.
in a
Yeah.
word. Like,
Mhm.
could you like put it in a nutshell?
The difference.
Yes, yeah, the differences.
Right. So I was saying that urban political ecology, sorry, is a kind of a more of an established branch of political ecology. So political ecology, without the U, the urban part, it just looked at how environmental politics, essentially. So how politics affect environmental decisions and outcomes, but it was largely based on agrarian issues. You know, in terms of like in rural parts of Africa, for example. So then, urban political ecology tried to apply this way of understanding cities. So critiquing this idea that cities are somehow separate from the natural landscape or environment, but it's very structural in terms of it focuses on these issues of power relations and capitalism and so on to look at these unequal, unjust outcomes of the environment and how people have these unequal burdens and sociological justice issues. But landscape, then, I think it brings in this approach from cultural geography, which, a lot of hardcore political ecologists might be, against this landscape approach or cultural geography approach because of their, philosophical underpinnings. But I think the landscape aspect is really interesting for bringing in the hybrid nature of both the urban and the rural and the cultural and natural and the discursive representations of the environment and the landscape, which are very central to the book, but not as central in urban political ecology. There's not as much emphasis on these post-structural elements in terms of like how space is represented by people. It's more of a cultural geography thing. So I thought that these two kind of approaches can work together quite productively. It's not only my argument; other people have written about that in other contexts, usually related to some kind of peri-urban development, like in California, for example. So yeah, does that answer it? Sort of, yeah. Okay.
Right. Just another theoretical question because, like you mentioned in your book, that one of the most dominant positions in the study of landscapes is the phenomenological perspective, which positioned people and the cultural context of the place at the center of understanding lived experiences of landscape. And well, because I used to teach contemporary media theory before this, and phenomenology was one of those classes, one of those theoretical classes which I taught. So like I found this interesting because so phenomenology basically it begins with the individual and their own conscious experience and tries to avoid prior assumptions and prejudices and philosophical dogmas, right? So and I remember there's this part of phenomenology which talks about living in the here and now and basically positioning yourself as a stranger when you look at things around you. So basically don't take things for granted. Basically question everything which you observe despite lived experiences. But of course, it doesn't mean that we have to completely alienate the two, lived experiences and being objective. So I mean, and it's interesting that it's, brought into the studies of landscape. So I was, is this whole argument about intersubjectivity and objective reality. And and even though every individual experience their own unique here and now experiences, it doesn't mean that we live in isolation, right? That's the whole basis of phenomenology. So it's, I'm just trying to draw this back to the study of landscapes, which you've done so beautifully in the book. Yeah, so like for the general public who might not have studied sociology, like how would you like put phenomenology into making people understand the studies of like landscape?
Yeah, very good question. So how do you relate it to kind of like everyday lived experience? Yeah. Yeah, so I think that everyday lived experience is quite central to the book, as I've said, in terms of how it's shaped people's ideologies and understandings and place attachment and so on. And that's, based on, say, growing up in Penang and perhaps spending time in the natural environment. And that might be different from people growing up in Kuala Lumpur or Johor Bahru, where you might have a kind of more strictly urban lifestyle, let's say, and then you might be more disconnected from the natural environment. So I think that kind of lived experience has really helped shape people's ideas about how Penang should or should not develop, and then that is really emphasized in the book. But it also, like I said, people don't have the same lived experience, and some people would just say, okay, well, especially in Hong Kong, for example, like we have huge amount of country park, natural spaces, and so on, but a lot of people don't have time to use those spaces. They spend a lot of time, 12 hours a day working, and then they have family and commuting maybe an hour. So if you're really like, you don't have time for those other things, and then you just want things that make your life maybe a little bit easier, would you like to be able to commute from Gurney Drive to Bayern La Pass in 15 minutes? Then yes, I would. Right. So those kind of like lived experience things, I think, really would help really inform urban development decisions and how they're understood and represented and supported or not by people.
Great example, because I live in Bayern La Pass and I work here. And like one more thing, because I taught cities and citizenship as well. Okay. And there's this quote, you quoted David Harvey, who's famous scholar, and he said that there is nothing unnatural about New York City, right? And so you mentioned that urban political ecologists have therefore sought to develop a framework for understanding the historically and geographically specific ways through which nature is urbanized. This work has been successful in disrupting the idea of the city as the antithesis of nature, and to direct attention instead to the processes through which the city is constituted as a socio-natural assemblage. So like drawing this to, well, of course, we can't exactly compare New York to Penang, Georgetown, but but I mean the whole, I mean the thesis behind it, behind Harvey's thoughts, really, like how would you place this in the study of not just Penang but like any other city in the world?
Right. Yeah. So okay. I mean, David Harvey has this famous quote that there's nothing unnatural about New York City, right? Which at the time that he said that, I think it was like 20 or more years ago. 96, okay, 30 almost years ago, right? That was kind of the underpinning of urban political ecology, emerged after that time as a discipline or subdiscipline. But his idea was that, yes, okay, there are all these like various natural inputs into the city. We have like Central Park, right? And that is kind of this urbanized nature. It's not a kind of pre-existing nature. So Neil Smith, who was a student of his, came up with this idea of first and second nature. So the first being this kind of pristine, untouched nature, and second nature being like, urban parks or landscapes and those kind of things, like the one that's now along Gurney Drive, that artificial park. So So yeah, that idea is trying to show that any city around the world is based out of natural and human inputs that have been, are now hybrid. And I think that particular quote from my book that you mentioned, it was relating back to this more kind of conceptual debate about urban political ecology, which had been criticized for studying cities and not their like wider landscapes. But actually, I argued no, urban political ecology has always studied urbanization as a process rather than just like a place, right, a site. And so I think that process is useful to understanding not only urbanization in Penang, but more broadly urbanization. Yeah.
Also, like when it comes to the methods that you used, I know like a lot of it was ethnographic, and you did interviews, walking interviews, and all. But also, what I found interesting, and I think, to be fair, I think this was due to the COVID era where you had to pick out or gather info, right? Really, gather data from using group chats, and I must say that there must be a lot of advantages and disadvantages to this method. Really, I saw like the advantages of it would be that you would be able to gather data from not just one geographical location, like people from one geographical location, but of like people from all over the world, really, on a specific topic. But then, how would you balance, the possibility of of unverified comments, for example, because anyone could say anything, really, on social media or even in closed WhatsApp groups, really. Some might say things with like vested interest, for example. Like, so how representative do you think or how verified rather would the data be? Like, how would you argue with that?
So a lot of students always ask me this question about like, oh, but how do I know if something is true, right? It's like, well, it doesn't matter for qualitative social science research. If like you're studying, especially in this book, I'm studying how issues are represented and how decisions are justified or presented to people. And so in that case, any kind of statement is valid, right? It doesn't, it might be true or untrue, as we know from, Donald Trump and his, what is it, like, the false fake news, right? But yeah, I mean, he always has like untrue things that he says, but then people believe it and use that to support him. So discourse is very kind of powerful in that sense. So yeah, I'm not so interested in the actual facts. I mean, that I can try and find out through other means. But I was more interested in the way things are represented and justified, in which social media is a great place to study that. Now, yes, the issue of using like online ethnography, for example, this is something that it pre-existed the COVID pandemic, but then, it really came to the foreground in academic discussions, methodological debates around like, how do we move our research online, and how do we use these different new types of information, and then raise a whole bunch of ethical considerations as well. So I think maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, someone in the Sustainable Penang chat said, "Oh, but I found that quotes from this group were used in this book, but like they weren't attributed to, any person's name, right? They would just be very generalized, and there was no kind of specific sensitive information taken. It was mostly about how development was understood and represented by people." So that it gets into this whole other discussion about like, okay, is a group chat like a social media, or is it different, or is it private or public or whatever? But I mean, one of the founders of the Sustainable Penang group saw it as a 24/7 town hall, and town halls are places for public discussion and debate. And so I think that was one of the useful things about it. But it's grown in size so much that I've like just keep it on mute all the time now. But it was very good for like, people would share links to, for example, Kota Kinabalu or Kuching is developing this kind of artificial rail transit, and oh, look what Suzhou is doing for their public transit. So like a lot of the chapter in the book where I talk about these other comparable models of transport infrastructure came very much from those links that were shared, not just like what people said, but the other kinds of aspirations for Penang's public transit, and that was really useful. So yeah, to see how people are like contextualizing Penang's development. So yeah, that's that, and I think it was kind of helpful, although not the same as being here physically. Would have obviously been better to personally be here, but couldn't do that, unfortunately. So yeah.
Like I think like that would also be, of course, issues of representation, because like only a certain group of people would belong to certain group chats, and then it wouldn't be a representative of, like, say, the silent majority,
sure.
right?
Yeah,
So
indeed,
yeah, so I
So
I mean, with every social science methodology, there are always advantages and disadvantages to it, and yeah,
like, I mean, that's, various people, government, and others have said like, oh, Penang Forum is like this very vocal minority rather than the silent majority, right? So, you can say the same about any kind of source of information, but yeah, I think the efforts to bring these kind of discussions into the public sphere and mobilize, get more people involved in terms of participatory planning are quite useful. Not everyone has the education and skill set to be able to be involved in planning discussions and decisions and so on. So yeah, there are arguments both sides that you could make, but yeah, I think presenting two different paths is useful.
it's
and
interesting.
Yeah,
That's for sure. To
yeah.
just see how the discourses how the discourse about like a topic like this would go on. And I mean, of course, it's always good to listen from different inputs, and like everyone has their own opinions, of course. I'd like to open the floor to questions if there are any.
Don't be shy.
Yes.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
I'm a guest here. I've been living here for 12 years in Penang on a second home status. Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, I'm quite interested in the developments as you have been describing. I have two observations, and I would like to have your comments on that. Yeah, my first observation is that there seems to be an imbalance between the huge number of high-rises we see everywhere coming up on this island, till such an extent that there is a major imbalance between the infrastructure in the widest sense of the word, roads, drainage, the whole combination of facts, which makes living here more complex. It's full. It's too full. There are too many cars. There are insufficient spaces for cars to be parked. And I'm aware of the transportation plan and what have you, but I'm afraid that that will be a bit in the future. That is one observation. My other observation is, it's more a question. A lot of money, an enormous amount of money, is spent on land reclamation, both on the east and the west side of the island. If you go to the mainland, but that is a layman's observation, there seems to be a huge amount of land available for further development. If I take a look at the dilapidation of a number of buildings on the mainland, if that should be taken up, it would cost a fraction of what is spent here. Again, they're layman's observation, but I'm very interested in how you look at these two issues. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for your observations and for coming along today. So you're very correct about both of those. I just learned the other day, actually, from Rebecca Wilkinson, who's in the audience, that okay, so developers who want to build a high density, building, they're given the approval to do so if they will invest in conservation of heritage buildings, right? I'm like, well, okay, that's good, but how are those two connected? Yeah, so you would think that maybe, okay, if they're going to get approval for a high density building, then they should maybe invest in public transit or some kind of other infrastructure that will help facilitate the density living in that place. And so that's been one of the main arguments against the type of development and that's been going on in Penang, including the City of Dreams that was, built there on the reclaimed kind of land. That part of Penang doesn't have the infrastructure for that many people. It was the same with the Penang Global City Center that was proposed. That, well, how are you going to accommodate all the thousands of people that are coming for conferences and things there? So yeah, that density is not really thought about. And you're right, there are too many cars. And so this alternative vision of the Penang Transport Master Plan, which actually was related to one of the initial consultant, reports that was paid for by the government but then not used, was that there should be more public transit and then less emphasis on car road infrastructure, because it just is like a short-term solution. You expand the roads, more people will drive. So you have to take this kind of proactive approach. Yes, you said you use like trains in Hong Kong and Singapore because they're necessary in places that have 8 million or 6 million or whatever people. Now, you're also right about the observation that many people live, or that there's a lot of land that could be available for development in the mainland, so or the peninsula. So why is then land being reclaimed in Penang Island? Well, it's more lucrative, right? So what are being developed are these like luxury apartments and things. So yeah, it's more profitable, ties into this capitalist urban development model that we see in other cities around the world. And it also, land reclamation is often preferred because it's this blank slate for development. You can reclaim the land and do whatever you want with it. You don't have to worry about, land ownership issues or like redeveloping land, knocking down buildings, getting, building permission, this kind of thing, zoning. So it is favorable for government and developers in that sense. And Hong Kong, and that's why they're doing the same thing, even though there's a lot of brownfield land in the new territories that could be used for development, but is not. Now, of course, places like Singapore has a lot of land reclamation. They need it because they have limited space. Of course, there are environmental issues with that. But yeah, there's not, anywhere else that they can go really. But yeah, that's the reason for the two. So I think one of the slogans of the Penang Transport Master Plan was move people, not cars, right? Because you're right, there are too many cars and it's difficult to get around as a pedestrian, especially with all the emphasis now on 15-minute cities where people should be able to get around, within a, kind of 15-minute public transit or cycle or something.
That's a good observation. But I must say though, like if we were to think back historically, most of Penang is actually sitting on reclaimed land anyway. It's nothing new. It's not new at all. I mean, I live in Bayan Lepas, and the whole area behind my house, which is like the whole area of say Queens Bay, and like the whole that whole part is sitting on reclaimed land. Many other parts of Penang as well, actually, it's on reclaimed land. And I think the whole think about making profit a dirty word might actually be problematic as well, because we do need profit. Otherwise, who's going to pay for everything, you know. So like, I mean, I of course respect both and all arguments and different opinions, but like, I think sometimes if we were to think that making profit is bad, I mean, then that's not exactly the right way to think as well. And of course, this is not coming from me. I'm actually quoting Lee Kuan Yew here. If you remember his 1980s campaign election speech, where I think he said Rajaratnam is always accusing him of making profits, and he went like, yes, we are, because like if we were to make profit a dirty word, Singapore would die. Yeah. Because and of course, you know, I'm not necessarily comparing Penang to Singapore in their 80s here, but yeah, I think the whole it would be quite, you know, it would be quite fruitful, and to sort of like think on both sides of the argument, and also to be realistic also. Land on the mainland, if we were to say that there's lots of land on the mainland, I mean, like a lot of land that is also being used now for the manufacturing and E&E and all that, and they need huge pieces of land, and we do need profit also. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's just 2 cents about this, really. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that perspective. I think like the difference here is who's profiting, right? So is it like the government that will profit and then can like reinvest that profit into, say, public infrastructure or education or other things, or is it developers that are profiting for their own good? So I think that's a crucial distinction. And then, you know, especially if you look at the Hong Kong example again, I mean, I use it a lot because I live there. Hong Kong is they always say that they have a housing shortage, right? They do not have a housing shortage. They have a shortage of affordable housing, because it's not in developers' interest to build affordable housing. So Singapore has like 80% public housing that is then affordable. Of course, it gets resold over time and becomes on the market, but yet that model was very helpful for allowing everyone to be able to buy a flat. So I think that's 2 different ways of understanding profit and urban development. So yeah, good comment, and from both of you, thank you.
Any other questions?
Oh yeah.
I also just wanted to say something about the mainland with lots of land versus reclamation. And it would be really helpful if somebody actually knows here, because I'm not sure if I'm 100% right in that. I think a lot of the land, sort of government land generally around the place, is under the federal government and not the state government, or there's limitations. Whereas if the state reclaims land, the state owns that government or that land and can do and whatever they want with it, and then to resell it, as it were, to developers. So I think there's that issue as well, possibly on the mainland. But it would be helpful if somebody actually knows the details. That's the gist of it, I think, but I don't know the details. But there is that issue between federal and state, and what state can just sell on their own, and they can do that with reclaimed land, but they can't do it with government land under federal, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, my name is Lim Ma Hui, former city councillor and also active member of Penang Forum. First, I'll thank you for the book. And I guess it's interesting that it looks like 2 chapters of your 6-chapter books, you know, are dealing with a lot of issues that Penang Forum has been championing. One question I have is, do you see any hope for Penang under the present government and all that to really come to grips with a kind of development vision, which I think you prefer to see. One that is equitable. I hate to use the word sustainable because it has been so captured. At least equitable, balance, human scale. And, given the fact that so many of the issues that civil society have been pushing for towards this kind of vision has been completely sidelined. Personally, I've been very much involved in the formulation of the Penang Transport Master Plan in 2008, when we came. I was involved in the group that started it, and as you rightly pointed out, it had been captured by the developers and it's been completely changed. And for the better, cheaper, faster alternative, which you displayed there, basically one of the former Penang Institute person, Stephen McDonald and myself were the co-authors of that, because we were challenged by the state to say that we were always critical and negative and we don't put anything positive forward. So we both wrote that. Although it's definitely not a master plan, but it's certainly a roadmap for an alternative vision, which has been completely sidelined. So personally, as I said, I feel that every battle that we fight, we have lost. Whether it's the PTMP, the LRT, Penang Hill, and reclamation, we've taken them to court, we lost. We spent a lot of money. So I don't know. So what is your hope for a more meaningful, participatory type of development? And then to address the question about land and whether there's enough land. It's true that the state government doesn't have a lot of land. Doesn't own a lot of land in Penang, both mainland and the island. Probably 10, 12 maximum % of the land is owned by the state. Okay? And this issue is not the federal. The federal government also does not own land much in Penang. So it's not the question of federal versus, it's actually most of the land, 90% owned by private people, right? So then is there enough land for quote unquote industrialization and development? And Dr. Bay was saying, you look at, and I've written a lot about this, right? When the government, Pakatan, that time was not Harapan, it was Pakatan Rakyat, government came in 2008. They inherited from the previous government 4,000 acres of land in Batu Kawan area, right? And I think the issue is the mismanagement of land, not whether there's enough or not enough land. 4,000 acres is a lot. Okay? And most of it now has just simply, according to them, finished. And I would gather that maybe, if you're lucky, maybe 10, 15, less than 20% definitely is used for proper industrial development. Most of it is for housing and all this stuff, and commercial development, of which we have too much, or at least not the right type of housing, and definitely commercial is very too much. So that's the only Batu Kawan, what they call phase 1. The phase 2, they were in the negotiating to acquire more from Sime Darby and all that, another 3,000 to 4,000 acres. Okay, and they run into some problem. And then if you look at the reclamation of the 3 islands, they say they want to do 1 now. And of the 2,000, which is Island A, which is about 2,000 acres, right? Only 700 to 800 acres are meant for the industrial zone, and supposedly the higher. The rest are either infrastructure or basically, high-end, housing. Of course, they will have some quote-unquote affordable housing there as a greenwashing, Okay, but that's it, 700 to 800 acres. Now you look at the recent sale of the land by the Penang state government to this UMC or whatever, of which there's been a scandal. And only yesterday, you can see that the former deputy chief minister of Penang, Ramasamy, is going to sue Chow Kong Yao and the state government over this scandal, right? What the amount of land is about 500-600 acres, and that was sold on not an open tender basis. So what rationale is there to say there's not enough land when you have 500-600 acres of land, right, that you sold, I don't know, under the table or whatever? They had to then rescind it and now have open tender, right? And then you want to destroy the whole ecological environment in the southern shores of Penang for 700 acres of land. So the issue is not the land. And finally, I know I'm taking a little bit of time, but I think it's very important for this group to understand this stuff about, yes, there is no link actually between the PTMP and the island and the need for generating the money to do the PTMP. That was originally, that's what Gamuda said, you know, that you need 46 billion ringgit, and therefore the state doesn't have money, therefore we have to reclaim this land and we can use it to build it. But it is a total nonsense. Because the PTMP, the LRT alone, one line, is going to cost, used to be 6 billion and now it's 10.5 billion and counting and more, probably 11, 12 billion. All right? And then now they're going to basically do Island 1A. And now the financing model is different. The government doesn't have money, so they're going to have a joint venture with Gamuda, of which the government will own 30% and Gamuda will own 70%. And using the data that Gamuda has given, I made a calculation, to cut the long story short, that after reclaiming Island 1, the government would probably get only 700, 800 million ringgit. That is not enough to build a couple of, what you call LRT alone is 10.5 billion. What are you talking about? 700 million ringgit. So there is simply no link. We were taken for a ride. That there is, this was basically a, way for developer to develop land. It's not that there's a need. I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
I'd like to answer the question.
Yeah, it's time's up actually. yeah. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for that comment. We're really just down to 2 more minutes. I think this gentleman.
Questions first, and then I can have a brief response to all. Yeah.
2 questions, 1 comment. First question is, what are the top 5 recommendations you give the government? Second question is, you comment based on your knowledge of the Transport Master Plan, what are the things that you think is good and bad about it? And lastly, overview of the one of the biggest things about Singapore is Singapore's development is driven by EDB, the Economic Development Board. Land are applied according to the economic values that we generate. There's nothing like that. And I've talked to foreigners who has factory in the past and all that. The government is not involved in trying to get them going. Penang sits at a rather unusual opportunity whereby American companies are being forced by their government to leave China, and they need to look for an alternative. Penang is on the top of the list, but the government is not maximizing the opportunity itself. So, but the reason I mention is because I don't see you mentioning economic development as part of the overall urbanization. Urbanization doesn't happen on its own. It needs to be driven by economy, whether it's in New York, Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, it's all driven by the economy itself. So there seems to be a lack of mention. Yes.
Okay, Sure. Yep. So I think like the economics certainly underpin the book. I mean, as Dr. Lim mentioned, that yeah, a lot of the decisions that are made in the PTMP are based on economic decisions, profit, but not necessarily the the public good. So in terms of recommendations, I would make well, I think there are a lot of basic infrastructure things that can be improved that are cheaper, faster. You know, as the better, cheaper, faster thing document had said that we can improve these basic things first, and then try and go from there. So whether or not I'm hopeful to answer the other question about, do we have this kind of socioecologically just form of development? In the dedication of the book, I do say I'm hopeful about that, but do I realistically think it'll happen in the short-term future? I don't, unfortunately, just based on, I haven't been here for 5 years, coming back, seeing, how things have developed in that time.
Okay, so I have quite a differing opinion, really, because like I was born and I lived here all my life, really. In things, I mean, in addressing your question about like what could be done, I mean, I don't think we need to look at the whole situation right now with so much doom and gloom, really, because like growing up here, I've seen both sides of the debate, and I see that both sides have their merits in their decisions. So, like I've seen like for the past 35 years, how Penang has also grown, and realistically also, I mean, it's no government has no faults, right? And I mean, I'm also just trying to think of the ecological part of the environment argument of it. I mean, like there are things like the Middle Bank, which is being gazetted as a marine sanctuary. And then when it comes to like Penang Hill, I know, there are debates on the development, but like as a Penang girl, I actually am impressed, really, with what's been done with Penang Hill. So yeah, I think there are always merits on both sides of the argument, and of different opinions, for sure. I mean, I think that is where it's like seminars like this is always good to, it's a good opportunity to listen to both sides, or different sides, not more than two. To just realistically come to having an open discussion like this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are some positive outcomes. Like I mentioned, the biosphere reserve, so is a good thing. And there have been some development decisions that have been overturned in the past, like, the kind of tourist resort, theme park on Penang Hill. So yeah, there are definitely some useful things that have happened. So it's not that everything has been like overturned or sidelined, but yeah, there are of course ways that things that can be improved. So.
As for all governments in the world.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So could you take this perhaps after this with the author? Thank you, because we have past time, and so I just really like to thank all of you for coming to Penang Institute today, and for being a great audience today. Thank you very much. No worries.